There's a small stone house standing alone in the middle of a valley. Smoke is still rising from the chimney on a November morning, before the mist has even had a chance to clear from the hillsides. Not far away, a man is herding his flock of sheep down an unfenced slope. No sound of machinery, no traffic, just a few short whistles, and a sheepdog that seems to understand him better than anyone else could. But then, just by looking to the other side of the valley, you'd see a completely different image. A roofless stone wall covered in green moss sitting silently among the tall grass. It's less than a kilometer from that house where smoke is still rising. These three images can be found side by side in countless places across Scotland. A roof that's still alive, a roof that has died, and between them lies a question this land has never fully answered. This is Scotland, a country with a population of about 5.5 million. But once you leave the crowded cities and head deep into the Highlands, the landscape starts to change fast. The roads grow longer, the houses grow sparser, and there are valleys so breathtakingly beautiful that you could drive for nearly an hour without encountering a single roof that still shelters someone. The strange thing is, these places weren't always this empty. Families once lived here for generations. They raised sheep, farmed the land, built houses of stone, and called these valleys home. So where did they go? And the people who still choose to hold on in this remote land, how do they make a living? That's the story we're going to uncover today. Not just how beautiful Scotland is, but the cost of continuing to live amid that beauty. And stay until the end. Because this story doesn't end with abandoned houses or people forced to leave. In some parts of the Highlands, something very different is happening. After more than 2 centuries of leaving, a quiet return is beginning. Part 1. Crofting, living where no one thinks you can. In the most remote parts of Scotland, there's a word you'll hear constantly: croft. From photos alone, a croft looks a lot like a small farm. A house sitting amid pastureland, a few sheep, sometimes shaggy Highland cattle mountains behind and sea in front. But crofting isn't simply farming. A croft is usually just a few hectares rented and worked by a family across generations. Beyond that, private plot, they also hold rights to shared grazing land on the surrounding hillsides. According to figures from the Crofting Commission, Scotland now has around 2,767 crofts, managed by about 11,500 people, with over 33,000 people living in crofting households, mainly across the Highlands, the Western and Northern Isles, Argyll and Moray. It sounds idyllic, but try picturing a winter morning here. You wake up while it's still pitch dark outside. The wind has been blowing all night. The first task isn't making coffee. It's putting on waterproofs and heading out to check whether the fences are still standing. A sheep might be stuck somewhere on the hillside. A shed roof might have just been torn off by the wind. The livestock need feeding before you even think about your own breakfast. And after all that, you still need another job. Because these days, very few families can live on crofting alone. Some teach. Some drive the school bus. Some work remotely thanks to the internet. Others sell wool lamb homemade jam or turn old houses into places for tourists to stay. Crofting survives not because it's easy. It survives because for many communities, if the croft disappears, the people may disappear along with it. But there's a more important detail here. Today, crofters hold fairly solid legal rights to the land they rent. That sounds perfectly ordinary. But their ancestors didn't have that right. In the 19th century, many families could be evicted from land they'd lived on for generations. The resistance of crofters, especially on the Isle of Skye, eventually helped bring about the Crofters Holdings Act of 1886, which gave tenants much stronger protection. And once you know what happened before 1886, you'll understand why that act mattered so much. Because there was a time when sheep were considered more valuable than the families living in the valleys. Before we get to that chapter of history, though, let's look at something else that has shaped life in Scotland for far longer than any act of law: The weather. Part 3. Why are Scotland's most beautiful valleys so empty? Let's go back to the stone walls from the start of the video. Without knowing the story behind them, you might think they're just abandoned rural houses. But many of them are traces of an era Scotland still remembers by a heavy name, the Highland clearances. From the late 18th century and through much of the 19th, the economic structure of the Highlands changed dramatically. Landowners realized that large flocks of sheep could bring in higher profits than maintaining small farming communities on the land. And once land became worth more than people, people had to go. Tens of thousands were displaced during this period. Estimates vary depending on how they're calculated, but they typically range from about 70,000 to over 150,000 people. On the Sutherland estates alone, around 15,000 people were displaced over roughly the first decade of the 19th century, as vast stretches of land were converted to sheep farming. Some families watched their houses torn down or burned so they couldn't return. Think about that. Not moving because of a better job, not selling a house to start a new life, but watching the place where your grandparents' parents and children once lived disappear. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of evidence still survives at Croik Church. In May 1845, 18 families were evicted from GLENCOE. About 80 people, including many children and elderly, made their way to the churchyard. They didn't want to sleep inside a sacred place without permission, so they stayed in the yard, in the cold. While waiting, someone used a sharp object to scratch a few lines into the church's east window glass. That pane of glass still exists today. On it is a message noting that the people of GLENCOE had camped in the churchyard on 24th of May, 1845. Just one line of writing. But behind it was an entire community that had no idea where they'd sleep the next night. At another place called Badbea, displaced families were sent to a narrow strip of land right against the cliffs on Scotland's northeast coast. They built their houses from stones gathered on the spot. The wind there was so fierce that local stories tell of children and livestock, sometimes having to be held or tied down to keep them from being blown toward the cliff edge. And yet, they lived there for almost a century. The last residents only left in 1911. But for many others, there was nowhere left to go in the Highlands. They went down to the harbors. They boarded ships bound for Canada, the United States, and Australia. They carried with them their family names, the Gaelic language, and memories of a valley on the other side of the Atlantic. Most never returned. That's why Scotland today has a population of only about 5.5 million. Yet there are vast numbers of people of Scottish descent scattered across the world. Those seemingly empty valleys are in fact far from short of stories. They're only short of the people who once lived inside those stories. And if the Highland clearances show what happens when people lose their claim to their own land, another Scottish valley holds the memory of something even more personal. Betrayal. Part 4. GLENCOE. The guests who killed their own hosts. Today, GLENCOE is one of those places that makes visitors slow down. The road winds between massive mountains. Clouds drift low along the slopes. After every rainfall, small waterfalls seem to appear almost everywhere. Cameras love GLENCOE, but history hasn't been so gentle with it. In the winter of 1692, a group of government soldiers arrived in the valley and were taken in by families of Clan MacDonald. They were fed. They slept under the MacDonald's roofs. They sat by the fire through the Highland winter. And this went on for nearly 2 weeks. In Highland culture, hospitality wasn't just a matter of manners. Someone welcomed into a home was placed in effect under the protection of their host. But before dawn, on 13th of February 1692, those guests woke up. and turned their weapons on the very people who had fed them. About 38 members of Clan MacDonald were killed in the attack. Many others fled into the mountains in the dead of winter, and roughly 40 more are believed to have died from exposure to the cold. The massacre shocked people not just because of the death toll, but because of how it happened. The soldiers weren't some foreign army that had stormed the village. They had lived alongside their victims, eaten their food, slept in their homes, then killed them. More than 3 centuries later, GLENCOE still stands, still breathtakingly beautiful. But once you know this story, you won't look at those mountainsides quite the same way again. There's something Scotland does strangely well. It doesn't hide its scars. It lets them sit right in the middle of its most beautiful landscapes. And perhaps precisely because history here was once so harsh, the small communities that still remain place all the more value on something else entirely: the feeling that no one should have to live alone. Part 5. Where strangers only need one evening to become familiar. In a small Highland village, your nearest neighbor might live several kilometers away. But that doesn't mean loneliness. Just step into a local pub in the evening, and you'll understand why. A pub here isn't simply a place that sells beer or whiskey. It's the shared living room of the whole community. Someone always sits in exactly the same chair. A dog always lies in exactly the same corner by the fire. Stories get told dozens of times, yet people still listen as if it were the first. And if you sit with a group of Scots, remember one small rule: the round. One person stands up and buys drinks for the whole table. Next time someone else does. No one needs to keep track. No bill-splitting app required. You just need to remember when it's your turn. Then on certain nights, the tables and chairs get pushed aside. A fiddle starts playing, and the room turns into a tale. This is the moment you discover that standing quietly in the corner, watching, isn't really an option for long. Someone will pull you in. Don't know how to dance? Even better. Within just a few minutes, the whole room is spinning, everyone laughing at their own mistimed steps. That's a very Scottish trait. Things don't need to be perfect for people to have fun. Even haggis, the dish the world almost automatically associates with Scotland, has a rather amusing truth behind it. It's not something every Scottish family eats every night. In an ordinary week, pasta or curry might show up far more often. These days, haggis is mostly tied to special occasions like Burns Night, and of course, tourists wanting to try real Scottish food. Whiskey has its own story. When whiskey sits for years in an oak barrel, a small portion evaporates through the wood, in the industry that is counted as lost product. But the Scots gave it a far more beautiful name: the Angel's Share. Perhaps that's how these communities survived the long winters: a warm room, a bit of music, an old story, a glass of whiskey, and the feeling that even though there's nothing outside but mountains, wind, and darkness, you still belong somewhere. But if you want to find the place where that feeling of belonging runs strongest, we need to go even further, off the mainland, out toward the Atlantic. Part 6. The islands where the old Scotland is still alive. Head west from mainland Scotland, board a ferry, and let the coastline slowly disappear behind you, and you'll arrive at the Outer Hebrides. Here the Atlantic Ocean still decides the schedule. Not your phone, not Google Maps, the sea. If the sea turns rough, the ferry can change. If the wind picks up, your plans have to change along with it. On the roads here, there's a small but very noticeable detail. Many road signs are written in Gaelic, first English, second. Scottish Gaelic was once the language of the large part of the Highlands and Islands, but after generations of upheaval, migration, and population decline, the number of Gaelic speakers dropped sharply. In 1891, there were over 254,000 Gaelic speakers. By the 2011 census, that number had fallen to around 57,600. It looked like a language slowly fading away. But then the 2022 census brought a notable signal. About 69,700 people, reported being able to speak Gaelic, and more than 130,000 had at least some skill in the language. For the first time in a long while, the trend line had turned. The story remains complicated. In the Outer Hebrides themselves, many traditional Gaelic-speaking communities continue to face pressure from an aging population and young people leaving the islands. But in Glasgow and elsewhere, a younger generation is now learning the language of their grandparents. Some things fade away, and sometimes, some things come back. On the Isle of Lewis, you can see another reminder that people were trying to leave their mark here long before any of us. The Callanized Standing Stones. These stones were erected roughly 5,000 years ago. 13 large stones form a cross-shaped layout around a central stone circle. Who built them? Why? To track the phases of the moon, to carry out rituals, or to tell future generations, we were here. No one knows for certain. But stand among those stones in the late afternoon. The Atlantic wind sweeps across the field. No sound of traffic, no city on the horizon. Just stones raised by human hands 5 millennia ago. And suddenly, why they were built stops being the most interesting question. The more interesting thing is this: the people who built them vanished long ago. Yet, their trace still hasn't disappeared. That's exactly the story now unfolding across the rest of Scotland. Part 7. The return that's beginning. So, after all these migrations, abandoned villages, and shrinking communities, will the Highlands keep losing people? Possibly. Recent studies, including warnings from the James Hutton Institute, suggest that many rural areas of Scotland still risk losing a significant share of their working-age population over the coming decades if nothing changes. Young people need jobs, they need housing, they need schools, healthcare, internet access, and a reason big enough to build a future somewhere far from the cities. That's a battle that isn't over yet. But if we only look at the abandoned houses, we'd miss half the story, because in many places, people are trying to bring life back. In 1986, ecologist Alan Watson Featherston founded Trees for Life with a very ambitious goal to restore parts of the ancient Caledonian forest that once covered this land. In 2008, the organization purchased Dundregan, a roughly 4,000-hectare estate in the Highlands. Since then, native trees have been planted and restored season after season. A forest doesn't come back overnight, neither does a community. But both begin the same way, with something small deciding to take root. Crofters, too, are adapting to survive. An old barn gets converted into guest accommodation. One family starts selling wool directly. Another opens a homestay. Tourists come to experience farm life, buy homemade jam, or simply take a photo with the shaggy Highland cattle. Tourism doesn't solve everything. But sometimes that small extra income is exactly what lets a family stay on for one more generation. And then there are those who return in a completely different way. Every summer in Highland cemeteries, you can see visitors walking slowly between the gravestones. In their hands isn't a tourist map, it's a family tree. They come from Ontario, Texas, Sydney, Oakland. They're searching for a surname, a birth date, someone who left Scotland almost 200 years ago. Sometimes they find it. A name covered in moss on a stone slab. A village they'd only ever known through their grandparents' stories. A valley their ancestors once called home. They haven't come to reclaim the land. They haven't come to rewrite history. They just want to stand there once and know that their family's story began in this place. Perhaps that's the strangest thing about Scotland. For generations, people left the Highlands, but the memory of the Highlands never really left them.